Welcome all to another round of Counseling 120. Today's lecture will center on one of the most important topics that exists within, that is to say, your body and mind, as we discuss the fundamentals of both physical and mental health awareness. Specifically, we will be covering the basics of the body by exploring the fundamental concepts of exercise and nutrition, as well as the basics of the mind by examining foundational concepts of mental health. And please note that today's goal obviously is not to learn everything there is to know about these topics, as these topics are simply far too rich and robust to be covered in one lecture. Rather, today's goal is simply to make sure you have a foundational understanding of the universal principles, meaning principles that can apply across the board for most, if not all, people, particularly pertaining to resistance training, to running and plyometrics, to nutrition, and again, to mental health. In an effort to properly prime us for today's content, I'd like to first dive into what I refer to as a quarter analogy, as originally discussed by writer and philosopher Alan Watts. So, if you look at a quarter, and of course, feel free to grab one if one is close to you, you'll always see two very distinct sides, heads and tails. The side is so distinct that we can literally make decisions based on flipping a quarter and seeing if that quarter lands heads up or tails up. We see this demonstrated in sports contests. We see it in fictional films with characters like Two-Face in the Batman anthologies. And of course, in some cases, we'll see it as a central component of gambling, as a quarter is designed to always elicit a 50-50 probability. There's a 50% chance it lands heads, there's a 50% chance it lands tails. There's no other alternatives, and there's no disputing these facts. However, if you take a moment to really take a step back and truly examine the details of a quarter, you'll notice its elevated ridges around its edges. You'll notice its true saturation of color, its weight when it's placed into your palm, as well as its natural shape. And if you take an even further step back, you'll notice something even more significant. Despite all of its individual and very distinct features, highlighted by one side being heads and one side being tails, it's still one thing. It's a quarter. And I know what you may be thinking. Yes, I knew that. This is common sense. Why are you telling me this? Which may be true. But the problem is that it's a very common human tendency to forget this concept when considering our own heads and our own tails. More specifically, our own mind and our own body. Just like the quarter, sure, we know that our mind and body are connected, but do we actually live in a means that reflects this union? Because without properly stepping back and intentionally holding perspective, it's so easy to misconstrue these two items, meaning our body and our mind, as separate entities, sometimes disjointed, which is why it's even more common to see imbalance when evaluating one's own holistic habits. On one end, it's possible for some to be so focused on their physical health that they ignore their mental psyche and their emotional well being, while on the other end, we have some who are so focused on the development of their mind that they ignore the basic tenets and the basic needs of their body. And to be clear, I'm not referring to the body in terms of having an Olympic physique or being a supermodel, nor am I referring to the mind in terms of being an academic genius. But of course, if you're any of these things, more power to you. Keep it up. I'm proud of you. But for the context of this lecture, what I'm referring to are just the basics of the body. Staying hydrated, consuming a relatively balanced diet with correct caloric balance, being physically active consistently, keyword consistently, to ensure that your bodily systems are functioning in a healthy manner. What I'm referring to are the basics of the mind, understanding one's own emotional triggers, putting mental states and conditions into proper perspective, developing resilience and grits, or even at its most grassroots of levels, ensuring that one is giving their mind and, of course, their body space to rest. Because, like the quarters, heads, and tails, our mind and our bodies work synchronously to form one item, and that item is you, the beautiful, the intelligent, the resilient you. Just as the quarter is composed of heads and tails, your being is comprised of the body and mind that have distinct features, that have different appearances, and that have unique anatomies, but the relationship is highly significant nonetheless. So, the goal of today is simply to remind you of the basics that both our body and our mind need constant and deliberate attention and focus, and the shortcomings of not taking care of one's body can potentially have serious effects on the mind, and certain levels of negligence of the mind can potentially have serious effects on the body. This, my Counseling 120 family and friends, is why we must always discuss the body when speaking of the mind, and always discuss the mind when speaking of the body. And side note here, while we're already on this topic, it's also a good time to remind you that no matter how damaged the head or tail side of a quarter is, no matter how scratched, no matter how less than pristine, no matter how dirty a quarter is, If you bring that quarter to a store, I guarantee you that no one's going to notice because at the end of the day, it's still going to be worth its 25 cents. So never forget that even if you feel that you need physical or mental improvement, physical or mental enhancement, physical or mental maintenance, because we all do at times, these variables will not negatively affect your value. And the last time I personally checked, we're all worth far, far, far more than 25 cents. And the same fact will remain true regardless of the physical or mental remedies we must seek from time to time. As we officially commence this lecture, we will first focus on exercise. Part 1 will focus on resistance training, while Part 2 will center on running and plyometrics. Although the scope of today's lecture once again is only to cover the basics, I do want to briefly mention that there are a significant amount of details that are required to really ensure a well-rounded, unique exercise plan that is specific to a person and their individual needs. Key variables that are determined by your specific goals, your tendency for injury or burnout, as well as your macro and micro lifestyle demands. Furthermore, with resistance training and running on plyometrics also, which will be discussed later on in this presentation, one must consider how to properly warm up, how to properly cool down, when to use free weights versus machines versus body weights versus free movement, as well as how to properly alternate between split and whole body focused training. Once again, this level of detail will not be discussed today, but I did want to briefly mention these and put these concepts on your radar just in case it's something you'd like to learn more about later. Today's focus instead will once again be on the general principles, or the universal principles more appropriately, that once again apply across the board for most, if not all people, as it is in this area where today's lecture will live. The first universal principle I need you to understand is a concept known as form equals function. And what this means is that the human body is basically this marvelous and organic entity that can shape itself, or in other words, form itself, based on what life requires of you, aka its function. So, if your lifestyle requires more endurance from you, you can literally introduce your body to elements of exercise that will elongate your muscles and allow them to be more efficient at pulling and utilizing oxygen for longer periods of time. If life requires you to be stronger physically, you can literally introduce your body to elements that will shorten and widen your muscular structure, as well as harden your skeletal system to withstand greater levels of force and impact. In other words, your body can quote unquote form itself to meet a needed quote unquote function. But of course, the key here is that you must be deliberate in your approach. So, with regards to resistance training, how do we do this? Well, it's based on its two universal principles. Universal principle number 1 is repetitions. Universal principle number 2 is rest. So, if you understand these two concepts of repetitions and rest with respect to resistance training specifically, then you're one step closer to embracing your body's ability to form itself to fit a specific function. Hence, once again, form equals function. Repetitions, also referred to as reps, are defined as the number of times you perform a specific exercise. So, for example, if one were to do a push up, you would lay face down on the floor with your palms down as well. One repetition or rep in this case would simply mean pushing your body up towards the sky, then returning back down to the initial starting position. So, in this case, one push up is one rep or one repetition. Similarly speaking, if one were to squat, either with weights or without weights, one would begin in a standing position. And as one lowers their body into a seated position, as demonstrated by the picture in front of you, then return back up to the initial starting and standing position, that too would consist of one rep, or in this case, one repetition. So in other words, one squat would be one repetition, one push-up counts as one repetition. So of course, by default then, rest is simply the amount of time you relax between sets of repetition. So whether you're doing 5 sets of push-ups or 10 sets of squats or 100 sets of whatever it is you want to be doing, rest is simply the time where you are not exercising between sets. So nothing astronomically difficult here, but it is very important to distinguish these terms because they, meaning repetitions or rest, they alone dictate what type of exercise you're actually doing. Allow me to use the next slide to elaborate. On the left-hand side, I place an arrow which illustrates repetitions. The top of this arrow represents 15 or more reps, while the bottom, as you can see, represents a smaller number, anywhere between 1 to 6 reps. So if one were to engage in endurance training specifically, This form of exercise would consist of high repetitions, once again meaning 15 or more, of light resistance, which is normally embodied by either your body weight or actual weights that are relatively light to the person who's exercising. As a result of training this way, one's body composition will naturally be more lean, more long, and overall just less bulky, allowing itself to accept oxygen with more ease, which directly results in one's ability to sustain activities for longer periods of time, hence the term endurance. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, is strength. This is embodied by the opposite, meaning lower repetitions, 1 to 6 reps more specifically, because of the heavier resistance. So instead of using body weight as discussed with endurance resistance training, strength resistance training actually requires machines, free weights, resistance bands, or other forms of heavier external forces. Exercising in this manner can actually help someone become stronger, bulkier, as mentioned, and overall just thicker because of the added resistance. But one would also be more prone to fatigue because, of course, oxygen now has a harder time to get your muscle fibers due to the added bulk and overall mass. So, if you ever find yourself in a situation where someone bigger or stronger than you is picking a fight, first of all, of course, don't fight. Be the more advanced human being here and spread love to counter hate. But hypothetically, if you were in this situation where there was this bigger and stronger person who's picking a fight and for some reason you just couldn't get out of it, your goal ought not be to fight them directly. It actually ought to be to tire them out first, meaning make them move a little bit, make them dance around a little bit, let them use their oxygen. Because essentially, when they consume that oxygen, it's going to be harder for them to reconsume it again because of their added mass. And once they do that, meaning once they're tired, once they consume the oxygen, all of a sudden their muscle fibers will operate at a lower capacity and less efficiently. And it is in that context that you're actually able to capitalize and basically take advantage of their own physiological flaws. So, of course, purely hypothetical, purely JK, again, love, don't hate. But if you were to find yourself in that particular situation, that's actually how you'd increase your probability for success. So with that aside, all silliness aside, the next category then of course is hypertrophy. This is that middle sweet spot which is embodied by around 8 to 12 reps of exercise. And this form of exercise activity allows one to basically be more lean and defined than someone who purely does strength. But on the flip end, it also allows one to be stronger and thicker than someone who strictly does endurance activities. So in other words, hypertrophy is that happy medium between the two aforementioned ideas of endurance and strength. Which now brings us to the last category here, which is power. And power is very similar to strength as far as repetitions are concerned, which again is 1 to 6 reps. But the difference is quickness and explosion of movement. So whatever activity one is doing, if they're doing it with the intention of developing their power, it must be quicker and it must be faster. So if you've ever taken a physics class, you'll understand this because power, the idea of power, is actually calculated by work divided by time. So what that means then is when you push, when you pull, and when you twist, that's not enough. That's just working because you have to divide it by time. In other words, you have to do it faster. Instead of just pushing, you must push faster. Instead of just pulling, you must pull quicker. Instead of simply twisting, you must twist with much more urgency in your movement. All of this to train your body's fibers to react with more speed, more explosion, and in some cases more aggression to once again develop said power. And as you can see by the slide here, there is my boy Kobe Bryant, who is the epitome of such power. With universal principle number 1 of repetitions now covered, allow us to shift our focus to universal principle number 2, that being rest. To properly ensure you're exercising the bodily system you desire, whether it's endurance, hypertrophy, strength, or power, I must clearly emphasize that rest is every bit as important as the exercise repetitions itself. So if you're targeting your endurance resistance training systems, your rest period should be shorter, specifically 1 minute or less, as this trains your body to learn how to pull oxygen quicker, or in some cases, how to operate more efficiently with less oxygen to consume, thus allowing you to sustain activity for longer periods of time. On the other end of the spectrum, when it comes to strength and power, your rest should usually be anywhere from the ballpark of 2 minutes or more. In some cases, I've seen recommendations for as long as 4 to 5 minutes, depending on how intense your activity is. But rule of thumb, of course, is 2 minutes or more, emphasis on the more. And if I can add here, A common mistake I used to always see in many young athletes and exercisers alike was seeing someone lift very, very, very heavy weights in resistance, but barely rest between their sets of repetitions. And sure, this may look cool and be inspiring on social media, like, oh, this person is a very hard worker. But remember, your goal is not to put on a show for others. Your goal is simply self improvement. Because if you're not giving yourself sufficient time to rest, you will be indirectly working your endurance systems because the muscle fibers that are required for strength and power will simply be too exhausted to function properly. So, as a result, without proper rest, many folks working strength and power don't get the results they desire because they're unintentionally working a different system, or in this case, they're working endurance, and eventually this can lead to discouragement. When in reality, the person, the exerciser, they're not the problem. It's simply a design flaw in their actual exercise routine. So if one just stayed disciplined with the rest intervals, just as they would with the repetitions, meaning universal principle number 2 and number 1, problems like this could be avoided. And lastly, in regards to hypertrophy, this is once again that sweet spot between endurance and strength and power, as its rest is classified between 1 to 2 minutes. So overall, by resting appropriately, meaning endurance is 1 minute or less, strength and power are 2 minutes or more, and hypertrophy is somewhere in the middle from 1 to 2 minutes. By resting appropriately, know that you are complementing your exercise repetitions, in other words, universal principle number 1, with its corresponding rest intervals, which is universal principle number 2. Thus, you are now truly and authentically capitalizing on the notion of form equals function with respect to resistance training. With the basics of resistance training now covered, we will now move on to part 2 of exercise, focusing on running and plyometrics. While the universal principles of resistance training once again are centered around repetitions and rest, which ultimately help us determine if we're doing endurance, hypertrophy, strength, or power resistance training, running on plyometrics slightly differs as it instead uses heart rate and rest as its universal principles of measure. Defined, heart rate is the speed of your heartbeat, normally measured by beats per minute, while rest, essentially the same definition from the previous slide, is the amount of time you relax between bouts of exercise. If you direct your attention to the left-hand side of the screen, notice that at the top of the arrow, it no longer says more reps, and at the bottom of the arrow, it no longer says less reps, as was the case for resistance training. Instead, it now says max heart rate at the top and resting heart rate at the bottom, because once again, it is your heart rate, not your repetitions, that determine the category of running and plyometrics one is using. So let's use long slow distance to demonstrate this, which is one of 6 running and plyometric categories we'll be discussing on this topic. Long slow distance is best personified by those who choose to exercise by way of walking, by power walking, or very slowly jogging. So slow, in fact, that the intensity of such exercise barely puts one above the resting heart rate. In case you don't know what your resting heart rate feels like, you're not familiar with the concept, just picture yourself sitting in your most comfortable chair or perhaps your most comfortable couch and you're watching TV. That's what your resting heart rate feels like. It's when you're literally just relaxing, chilling, and in this case, resting, hence the term resting heart rate. So if you can imagine yourself jogging or walking so slow that your heart rate activity is actually comparable to that of you sitting on a couch, then you understand what long slow distance running truly feels like. These intensities are so low that you can essentially do them for 20 minutes straight, for 30 minutes straight, or some cases for hours continuously, because once again, the intensity is so low when compared to other modes of exercise. The next category is pace tempo. And pace tempo is very similar to long slow distance. The difference simply is pace tempo is just more intense. So it's essentially just a moderately fast jog, which results in your heartbeat, of course, moving just a few beats faster. Sprinting and plyometrics, on the other hand, these are on the completely opposite end of the spectrum, as both activities push you towards your maximum heart rate. Sprinting, of course, meaning you're running with every ounce of power you have, while plyometrics, quite different, requires you to jump, to slide, to hop, to skip, and to explode with every ounce of power you have. And if you ever wondered what your max heart rate feels like, which of course is the opposite of a resting heart rate, all you have to do in this case, after of course properly warming up and making sure your environment is safe, of course, is all you have to do is go outside and run as fast and as hard as you can for anywhere between 60 to 200 yards. Or within the context of plyometrics, you can literally jump up and down as fast and as hard as you can for a solid 30 seconds or more nonstop. And as you listen to and sense your heart beating, how fast and how shallow it's beating, that's what a max heart rate feels like. So, going back to the idea of form equals function, if you notice elite sprinters and those engaging in intensive plyometric activities on the regular, they tend to be more stocky, more bulky, and overall just function in a more explosive manner, similar to resistance trainers who essentially focus on strength and power resistance training. Because, of course, one is essentially working the same underlying systems. The difference being, resistance training encompasses its goal with heavy weights and heavy resistance, while sprinting plyometrics, on the other hand, they accomplish their parallel goals primarily by, of course, running, jumping, and doing so very intensely. Very similar outcomes, just different means of getting to said outcomes. Long, slow distance, and pace tempo, the two styles that I first mentioned in the slide, these typically result in longer and leaner muscles, similar to those who engage in endurance resistance training. Because once again, you're working the same bodily system, the same system that trains your body to become more efficient at sustaining long and enduring activities. Again, the difference being, pace tempo and long slow distance encompasses this form of your body, or in this case your goal, by way of walking and jogging, while endurance resistance training, of course, encompasses their form of your body or your goal by way of basically very light weights and very light resistance. And lastly, just like hypertrophy was that kind of middle sweet spot in regards to resistance training specifically, running plyometrics also has its middle sweet spot, which results in a person being able to reap the benefits of both extremes I just mentioned, meaning they get some of the perks and benefits of those who sprint and do plyometrics, as well as some of the benefits and perks of those who engage in pace tempo and long slow distance running. These exercise modes, again in the sweet spot, in that middle spot, are known as fartlek training and circuit training. And if you're not familiar, fartlek training basically requires participants to alternate between walking and jogging and sprinting. So if you've ever seen someone at a park or at a track or maybe outside of their house or in your neighborhood, where basically they're jogging a lap and then sprinting a lap and then walking, then going back to sprinting, then going back to jogging, they're actually doing what's known as fartlek training, where once again they're alternating between the varying intensities. Circuit training is very similar, as it also breaks your exercise down into different stations with varying forms of running activities and varying levels of intensities. But the difference is circuit training includes plyometrics, which once again is embodied by jumping and hopping and skipping and sliding and so on, whereas fartlek training does not include plyometrics. Its sole focus once again is walking, jogging, and sprinting. With regard to the other universal principle with respect to running on plyometrics, rest is directly related to heart rate. In other words, the higher the heart rate, as is the case for sprinting and plyometrics, the more rest you will need, normally in the vicinity of 2 minutes or more, emphasis of course on the more. Conversely, the lower the heart rate, as is the case for long slow distance and pace tempo, the less rest you will need, again in the area of 1 minute or less, or in some cases no rest at all, as the entire bout of exercise is completed in one continuous low intense round of walking and or slow jogging. As a result, what are the primary effects of engaging in routine exercise, of introducing your body to carefully planned repetitions, to carefully calculated heart rates and rest by way of resistance training and running plyometrics? Well, for one, it can positively affect your ability to resist fatigue. With endurance activities like endurance resistance training, as well as long, slow distance and pace tempo running, you can obviously improve your endurance, thus increase your ability to resist both the intensity, meaning how strong, and the frequency, meaning how often that you experience fatigue. The second component is body composition, as we've already mentioned. Now that you understand the idea of form equals function, regular exercise can indeed help you manipulate your composition within your own genetic disposition, whether it means longer and leaner muscular structures or stockier and thicker structures or some sort of hybrid in between. All of this can be affected by the types of exercise that you choose. A third component, of course, pretty straightforward, is it does increase your strength and power. But fourthly, on a very related note, consistent exercise can also affect your VO2 and 1 rep maximums, which simply means that carefully planned exercise will not only help you get stronger, more powerful, as briefly mentioned in the previous bullet point, but it'll also help you increase your peak maximum heart rate, as well as your peak maximum ability to rep higher levels of weight and resistance. So in lay terms, it means the best version of you can also become better. And lastly, this will be organ system efficiency. This is key because there's a misconception that exercise only affects your muscular system, but in fact, it affects all 10 of the systems of which you are comprised. Routine exercise, once again, by way of resistance training and running plyometrics, can have positive implications on, yes, your muscular system, but it can also affect your immune system. It can increase the rigidity of your bones and help fight osteoporosis by way of your skeletal system. It can help you breathe cleaner and more efficiently via your respiratory system. It can help you normalize your digestive processes through your digestive system, of course. It can help increase the efficiency of blood flow within your circulatory system, as well as regulate your endocrine, your urinary, your nervous, and your reproductive systems. In other words, the simple act of engaging in routine but intentional exercise through both resistance training and running plyometrics, you can basically help your entire body in every single system of which our bodies are comprised. As we enter the next phase of this lecture, we will now cover the basics of nutrition. To properly synthesize the deep and symbiotic relationship between exercise and nutrition, let's take a moment to recall the effects of exercise. It is to once again resist fatigue, to enhance your body composition, to increase strength and power, to increase VO2 and 1 rep max, as well as to improve your overall organ system efficiency. When you break nutrition down into its general effects, notice that they're going to be essentially identical and parallel to that of exercise. So, for instance, as we've already mentioned, exercise can help us resist fatigue, but the proper consumption of carbohydrates and fats can also help by ensuring we have these additional short and long term energy sources by way of what we eat. Furthermore, while exercise can help us with our body composition, proper consumption of proteins and fats, both which are key components to the cells that create us and essentially help us move, can also have significant effects on our overall body composition. Next up, if you stay properly hydrated by drinking healthy amounts of water and electrolytes, not only will our liquids remain balanced, of course, but it can also positively affect our ability to develop strength and power, since water and electrolytes actually play a key role in our musculoskeletal contractions. Additionally, proper intake of vitamins and minerals, they have these microscopic effects on our coenzymes, and that too parallels the microscopic effects of our VO2 and 1 rep maxes. And lastly, just as we mentioned, consistent and deliberate exercise can positively affect all 10 of our organ systems. Nutrition, too, can have significant effects on all 10 of our organ systems, not just our digestive system, as some may assume. And basically, all this to say that exercise without nutrition or nutrition without exercise it's basically akin to getting half of a haircut or only wearing one shoe or one sock or one pant leg, as both items are needed for optimal effects. So don't forget that half measures, they only produce half results. So proper maintenance of the temple that is your body, it will require congruent effort among both your exercise and your nutritional habits. Before we jump into more detail, similar to what I said about exercise, I must add that today's discussion will not cover some very key details. Due to the unique nature of your individual genetics, your lifestyle, the supplements you take, cheat days versus regular days, weight goals, whether one plans to maintain, lose, or gain weight, and other concepts known as macronutrient manipulation, there are simply far too many variables to understand when it comes to proper diet and nutrition, items that we simply cannot cover within the scope of one lecture. But fortunately, similar to what we covered in exercise, our scope in this section of the lecture is simply to cover the universal principles towards understanding proper nutrition for all. So, if you recall, resistance training had two universal principles, repetitions and rest, while running and plyometrics also had two universal principles, more specifically heart rate and rest. So, in this section of the lecture pertaining to nutrition, we will cover its 7 universal principles. Principle number 1 being caloric intake, principle number 2 being caloric distribution, principle number 3, water intake, principle number 4, vitamin and mineral intake, number 5, sources, number 6, meal distribution, and number 7, everyone's favorite, a cheat day. So as we have this in our purview, allow us now to focus on principle number 1, which is going to be your overall caloric intake. In an effort to properly measure your required caloric intake, meaning how many calories one should be consuming, there are numerous variables to consider, such as your age, your current weight and overall height, your body composition, your physical activity level, and of course your genetics, also known as your basal metabolic rate, aka your metabolism, as well as your personal goals, whether it's to gain weight, to lose weight, or simply to maintain weight. So, what happens here is that these factors get plugged into what's known as a regression equation, which basically gives you an output or an answer that tells you how many calories you should be consuming based on the variables you've provided. Now, the beautiful thing about this is that, of course, you don't have to do the mathematics yourself. Nowadays, there's numerous websites and apps that help do this for you. And while there are many to recommend, one simple way to actually start on this process is simply using the MyFitnessPal app. It's an app that essentially is free. It's very effective because, again, it helps identify how many calories you need and where to get those calories from. And more importantly, it is generally supported by most health practitioners within the physical health and kinesiology world. Once you know your caloric intake, the next step is to determine your caloric distribution. And key here is to remember that there's only six major nutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water. And of the six nutrients I just mentioned, only three of those actually have calories, and these are what are known as macronutrients, or macros for short. So, what macronutrients are simply carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, because vitamins, minerals, and water are calorie free, thus are not part of your overall calorie count. Now that we've established that only carbohydrates, proteins, and fats have calories, a natural follow up question is how much of my total calories will come from carbohydrates versus proteins versus fats? This can primarily be determined by your lifestyle and activity levels. So, if you consider the quote unquote average person, meaning someone who kind of dabbles in the realm of exercise or you're just getting started with exercise, so it's probably not a normalized part of the routine, this type of lifestyle will normally require a distribution of 55% carbohydrates, roughly 20% proteins, and roughly 25% fats. So, while of course a person's individual details can kind of skew some of these numbers, this is very typical for the quote unquote, again, average human being. But if a person does regularly exercise and primarily chooses to do so with endurance activities, like let's say jogging, walking, hiking, or lifting with relatively lighter resistance, then that person's overall number of carbohydrates would actually increase, as demonstrated by the percentage breakdown here. Notice once again that only the only significant difference here is again the increase in carbohydrates, which overall makes sense because since endurance activities require longer bouts of energy and carbohydrates are the primary source for short and long-term energy, the ideas essentially align. Let's now take a third and final example here. Let's say if one person's lifestyle and activity levels included short and intense activities like sprinting and plyometrics or heavy resistance training by way of strength or power, then what would be different here is their protein distribution. As you can see here, there is a slight increase, which also makes sense because since strength and power-based activities require more intense bursts and charges of energy, the added proteins in one's diet basically helps assist with both movements and healing of said movements once it's time to rest again. All that to basically say that proper caloric distribution is significantly influenced by lifestyle and activity levels, once again highlighting that symbiotic relationship between both exercise and nutrition. With regard to water intake, this one is relatively simple as it's simply tied to your caloric intake. So, whatever amount of calories you consume, that's usually going to dictate the amount of water that you should be drinking. So, for instance, if someone is designated with a 2,000 calorie diet, then that means they should be consuming roughly 64 to 80 ounces of water. So, for context, a regular bottle of water holds roughly 17 ounces. So, that means you're going to be drinking anywhere from about 3 to 4 bottles of water. Then what you can notice here as far as the patterns are concerned, as the calories increase, so does your water. So 3,000 calories means you should be drinking roughly 7 bottles of water, 4,000 calories meaning roughly 9 bottles of water, and so on and so forth. With regard to vitamins and minerals, please always consult with your physician first, of course, but assuming you're okay to do so, please consider actually including foundational supplements such as daily vitamins and minerals into your regular diet for the simple fact that life moves really fast. I mean, in a perfect world, sure, we can all sit there and eat these very nutrient rich foods that are fantastic for our minds and our bodies, but in reality, we A, don't always have the time to prepare such foods, and B, don't always have the money to afford it. So, a simple and cost effective way to ensure you're getting your proper vitamins and getting your proper minerals and other nutrients for that matter is simply to assimilate supplements into your regular diet. The fifth universal principle is determining your food sources. In other words, identifying what foods you will eat to meet your carbohydrates, your protein, your fat, your vitamin, your mineral, and your water needs. So, in other words, you want to make sure that they're affordable or more specifically sustainable. You want to make sure that you're aware of your own limits, whether it comes to food allergies or food sensitivity. And you want to be aware of your own preferences. Because at the end of the day, I'm fully aware that some of the healthier foods may not be your favorite, but your goal is to at least do your best not to choose your least favorite. In other words, don't choose foods you hate or make you feel miserable. Because at the end of the day, for proper dieting and nutrition to take full effect, it has to be integrated into your lifestyle. It can't just be a cycle or a section or a chapter of your life, but it's got to be part of your day to day routine. And in order for you to increase your probability of doing that, you must choose foods that are both sustainable and relatively enjoyable. Furthermore, here are some common sources per each nutrient. Some of these, of course, pretty obvious, but it's just always nice to remind others of the basics from time to time. So when it comes to carbohydrates, common sources are bread, pasta, potatoes, rice, and grains. When it comes to both proteins and fats, they're very commonly found in meat, seafood, eggs, beans, nuts, and seeds. Water, obviously, will be found in water, as well as juice and teas and other functional beverages. And lastly, when it comes to vitamins and minerals, these are going to be very prevalent in your fruits, your vegetables, cheese, yogurt, and other dairy products. Universal principle number six is simply meal distribution. So it's just a courtesy reminder to not forget that smaller meals throughout the day, if possible, is the optimal way to eat. So whether we're talking about a typical breakfast, lunch, and dinner with a snack here or a snack there, the goal is to evenly distribute your nutrients. So that way you don't crash in the middle of the day or late at night, or in some cases have rough starts to your morning. You really want to make sure that whatever your caloric intake is, whatever your nutrients are, that they're equally, or at least as equally as possible, spread out throughout the entirety of your day. The seventh and final universal principle is determining a cheat day. Because yes, cheat days are real, and yes, cheat days are supported by science. So, for those unfamiliar with the concept, it's when you choose anywhere from 1 to maybe 2 days out of the week where you eat a little bit more or a little bit less calories than what's normally recommended. And the purpose of this essentially is to manipulate your metabolism, also known as a basal metabolic rate or BMR. The goal is to stop that from basically resetting itself. Because what happens is once your metabolism resets itself, it makes it harder for you to actually grow or to improve based on the nutrition and the exercise you're introducing to your body. Because once it resets itself, it basically sees your exercise and it sees the nutrition that you're currently eating. It says, oh, been there, done that. So it no longer has the same effects. So by introducing a cheat day to your diet, usually once again 1 to 2 days out of the week, it stops your metabolism from doing that and keeps it fresh from really absorbing the external stimuli through exercise and nutrition in which you're introducing to your body. With the basics of exercise and nutrition now covered, this is the theoretical impact. Introducing consistent exercise and nutrition to your foundation, meaning your body, can put you in a better position to stabilize your mind, encouraging both positive mental thoughts and positive emotional well being. In other words, no, regular exercise and nutrition will not automatically mean you will have positive mental health. That would be a very reckless claim. What I am saying though is that by establishing a solid base comprised of regular exercise and intentional nutritional habits, one is setting a much, much stronger foundation and platform for positive mental health to develop. As we shift to the basics of mental health, here's a courtesy reminder of the topics we've actually already covered in previous lectures that tie into the notion of the body and mind connection. We've discussed the importance of thoughts and language and the relationships between what we say and how we think. We covered strategies regarding increasing motivation as well as developing self confidence. We've discussed how mindfulness can lead to subsequent fearlessness and basically how life's ups and downs can be best battled by our ability to develop resilience and persistence. Furthermore, we've also covered the importance of proper goal setting, different strategies on imagery, different tactics regarding concentration, as well as arousal regulation techniques through both bodily and mental strategies, aka somatic and cognitive self regulation. So, the beauty is that even before we formally define mental health and watch the two introductory videos I have in this foundational presentation, Please note that we've already been developing significant mental health skills and interventions, whether you realize it or not. Nonetheless, being the masters that you are and always have been, what is the formal definition of mental health? Well, if you look at your slide in front of you, mental health is defined as a continuum of a person's psychological and emotional well being, from positive mental health to mental disorders, also referred to as clinical diagnoses. So the goal is to be able to develop your ability to deal with these negative thoughts and negative emotions, as the purpose is not, nor was it ever, to strictly eliminate negativity, because as we've mentioned in previous lectures, negativity will always be a part of life. So the goal rather is to be able to monitor and properly deal with these negative thoughts and emotions, and of course to identify support when things feel like they're overwhelming. So, with that definition and with these goals in mind, I'd like to proceed now by playing two introductory videos regarding the topic. The first video is titled, "What is Mental Health?" And the video that will play subsequently thereafter, video 2, is titled, "We All Have Mental Health."
We all have mental health. It is just as important as physical health. It is not only about mental illness or mental disorders. This is just one part of a bigger picture. It's best to think about mental health as being on a continuum, rather than people being either mentally ill or mentally well. We are all on the continuum, and we move up and down according to factors such as our genetic makeup and upbringing, our life circumstances, and the stresses we are under. At one end of the continuum, we have mental disorders, like depression or anxiety. And at the other end, we have states of positive mental health, when we're thriving, content, and fulfilled. The aim of mental health interventions is to move people up the continuum, so that they're able to reach their full potential and live satisfying lives. The World Health Organization describes mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Being mentally healthy means being resilient and able to cope with difficult times, feeling in control, being confident, feeling good about yourself, managing and expressing your emotions, building and maintaining good relationships. We all experience periods when we feel stressed, worried, anxious, sad, afraid, or angry. These are all normal emotions. However, when these emotions become severe enough that it interferes with a person's ability to function daily, and these feelings become persistent over time, then it can develop into a mental health problem. There are many different types of mental disorders. When left untreated, mental disorders can be chronic and long-lasting, and are associated with increased disability. They significantly have an impact on daily functioning and frequently interfere with family, social, and work responsibilities. Fortunately, there are effective treatments and evidence-based interventions available that aim to help individuals understand and cope with symptoms of mental illness. However, very few people with mental disorders access existing treatment services. This may be due to barriers such as the stigma attached to seeking help, the lack of understanding of mental health problems, uncertainty of how to get help, or the fear of disclosing mental health problems. Research shows that stigma remains one of the biggest factors preventing people from seeking help early for their mental health problems and getting the appropriate support they need. It is important to acknowledge that we all have mental health and have a personal responsibility to learn how we can improve and maintain our well-being in order to lead meaningful and satisfying lives. Want to learn how you can do this? Great news! Why not join one of our communities and keep exploring Maudsley Learning online? can't tell how someone feels just by looking at them or what they share online. To the outside world, our lives may look perfect, even if in reality they aren't. I'm always worrying about doing well at school, and with the end of year test coming up, I'm not sure how much longer I can cope. My thoughts swarm around my head, sometimes keeping me up all night. Some days it's just all too much, and I feel like I'm lost in space. When I did badly on one of my tests, I just about kept it together until I got home. Then I broke down crying in front of my mum. She listened for a bit, and then she told me that, just like physical health, we all have mental health. It's our feelings, our thinking, our emotions, and our moods. She then said that feeling down, angry, and stressed is a normal part of life, just like it's normal to feel happy, confident, and carefree sometimes. We all have positive and negative emotions that come and go based on what's happening around us. These are everyday feelings. Good mental health means experiencing negative emotions. It's not always about being happy. Mum can relate to the feelings of stress. So when Mum suggested I take a break from everything and do something I enjoy, I actually took her advice. So I made myself a hot chocolate, snuggled up in a duvet and watched a film. And you know what? Afterwards I felt so much better. Mum should take her own advice.
Most of us only ever share the good things. We don't like to share how we really feel. Every morning when I wake up, negative thoughts stream through my head. Getting out of bed and pretending I'm okay takes all the energy I have. As the day goes on, the negative thoughts turn from a stream into a river. The water rushes through my head so loudly it's hard to concentrate in lessons. And some days it's so bad it feels like a waterfall that's trying to pull me over the edge. Everything is so overwhelming. I didn't think my friends would understand if I told them how down I was feeling. But when Sasha opened up to me about how stressed she was feeling, I told her. I wasn't sure how to bring up how I'd been feeling, so I started by saying that I didn't feel like myself. Just her listening made me feel like she understood. She told me some things that had helped her, so I tried them too, but it didn't make much of a difference. Even when I tried to be around my friends, I felt alone. The things I used to enjoy weren't fun anymore.
I was really worried about Andre and not sure what to do. He was quiet and wasn't hanging out with us like he used to. So I asked our head of year for some advice. He suggested I get Andre to speak to him since his negative feelings weren't going away.
I didn't want to speak to our head of year, but I also didn't want to keep feeling so down, so I went. He said that sometimes we have overwhelming feelings that can be more intense than our everyday feelings. These feelings hang around for a long time and change the way we feel, think, and behave. They can stop us doing what we want to in life. That's what I was going through. He also said that if we're physically unwell, we let people know, we ask for help. It should be no different with mental health. Sometimes our overwhelming feelings are brought on because of things in our life. Sometimes they happen for no reason at all. After hearing this, I felt much less alone and it felt good to talk. Scientists have found exercise can help when you're feeling low, so our head of year encouraged me to sign up to the school football club, which Sasha was already in. I still have days when the river is there, but now I'm beginning to understand my mental health. I'm learning how to cope. Our head of year reminded me that my friends, family, teachers, and lots of others at school are there to help just as much as he is. I had no idea the people around me could be so understanding. And while it's not always easy to talk about my mental health, the person I'm talking to might be able to help. If you don't feel like talking, that's fine. You could try writing, sports, reading, art, music, playing with your pet, whatever makes you feel better.
If you're the person someone talks to when they're struggling, just listen with no pressure or judgments. You don't have to have the answer. If you feel unsure about anything, you can speak to a trusted adult. Talking about mental health doesn't have to be difficult. After all, it's something we all have.
In closing, please know that I fully acknowledge that at the end of the day, yes, we've now discussed the elements of basic exercise, nutrition, as well as mental health, But I'm fully aware that this is a challenging process, meaning it's really challenging to truly integrate these ideas and these concepts in your day-to-day routines. So please let me take this moment to let you know and just remind you that I'm fully aware that it is going to be a challenge. So just remember that none of this was about perfection. None of this is purely about outcomes. It's all about self-improvement. It's all about embracing the process. And at the end of the day, if you really establish strong and solid and sound foundational processes, the outcomes will take care of itself. So just focus on today, focus on the process, and let the outcomes play out as they will. So if this quote helps, remember this: look at a stonecutter hammering away at the rock, perhaps 100 times without as much as a crack showing in it. Yet at the 101st blow, it will split in two. And I know it was not the last blow that did it, but all that had gone before. Jacob Riis. So once again, processes, y'all. It's all about the processes. Thank you for joining me today. I will see you in the next module.